The Norsemen. They have come.
The monk is alone in the scriptorium when he hears them. Oars. Too many oars, moving too fast across water that should be empty.
To the shore, quickly!
For 150 years, this island has known only the sound of wind, bells, and prayer. But this morning, the 8th of June, 793, it is about to learn a new sound, one that will change every coast of Europe, one that will reshape an entire language. And one that will give the medieval world a word it had never needed before: the Vikings. Welcome to Mystique History. How did one single raid on one quiet island end up rewriting the story of England? Its towns, its laws, its marketplaces, and even the English words you are listening to right now. Let me walk you through it. The place where this story begins is called Lindisfarne, a tidal island off the northeast coast of Northumbria, connected to the mainland only at low tide, otherwise cut off by the grey North Sea. The monastery here has stood undisturbed since St. Aidan of Iona founded it in 635. For a century and a half, it has been a quiet lighthouse of scholarship and sanctity, producing illuminated gospels of extraordinary beauty, guarding the relics of St. Cuthbert, drawing pilgrims from across the Christian world. Inside its walls are gold and silver chalices, embroidered vestments, jewel-bound manuscripts. Centuries of careful wealth accumulated in the service of God. And here is the part that is hard to grasp from our own century. Lindisfarne has no walls, not real ones, because no one has ever attacked a monastery before. The concept has not occurred to anyone. Sacred ground was protected by God, and by the simple, universal understanding that civilized people did not do such things. The ships appear from the northeast, low in the water, their curved prows cutting the grey morning faster than any vessel has a right to move. Perhaps 100 men aboard, armed, trained. They know exactly why they have come. By the time the alarm is raised inside the monastery, the ships are already grounding on the beach, and the men are already running up the sand toward the church. What happens next genuinely breaks the medieval mind. A scholar named Alcuin, writing from the royal court of Charlemagne in continental Europe, struggles to describe it. He writes that the church of St. Cuthbert has been laid open. He writes that the altars have been stripped bare. He writes that the holiest place in the north has been given over to ruin. And then he writes a line that reveals just how deeply this single morning has shaken the world of 9th century Europe. Never before, he writes, has such a terror appeared in Britain. And I want you to really feel what this meant. For the Christian Europe of that moment, an attack on a monastery was not simply a crime. It was almost a conceptual error, like gravity suddenly behaving differently on a Tuesday. The world was not supposed to work this way. The sea was not supposed to bring this. The England that those ships had just sailed into in 793 was not a single country. It was a patchwork of rival kingdoms. Northumbria in the north, Mercia across the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, Wessex in the south, each with its own royal family, its own laws, its own long list of internal disputes. These kingdoms spent enormous energy fighting each other, which is part of why the threat from the sea took so long to be taken seriously. The Anglo-Saxon world was Christian, literate, agriculturally sophisticated, and deeply local. Most people lived their entire lives within a radius of 10 or 15 miles from home. The world beyond the horizon was known mainly through scripture, through rumour, through the occasional traveller's story. Nobody had warned them about this. The raids that followed Lindisfarne were not, at first, a plan. They were an opportunity, repeated, refined, and steadily industrialised over decades. Monasteries were rich, concentrated, unguarded, and placed along coastlines and riverbanks that the Scandinavians' remarkable ships could reach with almost casual ease. And this is where we have to pause on the ship itself. Because the Viking Longship was one of the great technological achievements of the early medieval world. I have stood beside a reconstructed Longship in Oslo, and I can tell you, up close, it does not look dangerous. It looks beautiful, almost delicate. That curved hull is one of the most perfectly designed vessels in history. Shallow enough to beach on almost any shoreline, light enough to be dragged overland between rivers, fast enough under sail or oar to outrun anything that dared to give chase. It was not merely a boat, it was a key. A key that quietly unlocked every coast, every river, every unguarded stretch of water in the known world. For decades, the raids followed the same rhythm. Ships arrived in late spring, after the crossing conditions improved. Men came ashore, took what could be carried, and were gone again before any organized defense could gather. They took silver, gold, cattle, cloth, and sometimes people. The slave markets of Scandinavia and the Islamic world paid in silver, and human beings were a cargo as valuable as any other. In the villages along the English coast, the sight of a dragon prow on the horizon had become, within a single generation, the specific shape of catastrophe. Church bells, once rung only for services, were now rung for warning. Walk into an English village in the 840s. Let us place it in East Anglia, where the rich farmland runs flat and open to the sea. And you are walking into a community that has quietly reorganized its entire existence around a new fear. The church valuables have been moved inland to wherever the bishop's seat is safer. The jeweled gospel book and the silver chalices are no longer stored where a ship could reach them within an hour. The farmers' wives and older children know, without anyone explaining it to them, to run toward the forest at the sound of the church bell rung 3 times rapidly.
Quickly now, keep moving! To the woods!
The men of the village have been organized into a watch rota by the reeve, the village headman, with someone keeping eyes on the river mouth at all hours.
Be vigilant. This staff and spear are the village's safety.
None of this is written down anywhere. It is knowledge accumulated over 50 years of raids, passed mouth to mouth, adapted by each new generation to the specific geography of their own stretch of coast. Then, in the autumn of 865, everything changed again.
Or the birds rise suddenly to the...
The raids stopped being raids. What came ashore in East Anglia that season was something England had never faced before. A combined army of Scandinavian warriors that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded with a name that still echoes through history. The Great Heathen Army.
Forward, warriors!
Its leaders were said to be the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, Halfdan, Ivar the Boneless, names that live on in the sagas and the chronicles alike.
And then we hit their berth at the crossing. Move the plows to the upper beach.
And their intention this time was not to raid and leave.
Quickly!
Their intention was to stay. Within 2 years, the Great Heathen Army had captured York, Northumbria's royal city, the second most important city in England, and installed a puppet king on the Northumbrian throne. By 871, they had taken East Anglia and ended the reign of its king. By the late 870s, only one English kingdom still remained unconquered. Its king, Alfred of Wessex, was hiding out in the marshes of Somerset, and the survival of the entire English crown rested on a single man who had been driven from his own capital and was rebuilding an army from almost nothing.
We train until the mist lifts!
Alfred won. The Battle of Edington in 878 was one of those rare military moments that genuinely changed the direction of history. The Viking leader Guthrum was defeated, accepted Christian baptism at Alfred's personal insistence, and signed a treaty that drew a line clear across England, from the Thames estuary northwest to Chester, with the English on one side and the Vikings on the other. That Viking territory became known as the Danelaw. And the name is worth pausing on. It does not mean simply a place where Danes lived.
Of the thing. In accordance with the ancient laws of the Danes, this boundary stands firm.
It means a place where Danish law applied, where the Scandinavian settlers governed themselves by their own legal traditions.
The scales are balanced.
Where a man's worth, the vergild payment owed to his family if he came to harm, was calculated by Norse custom rather than Saxon. For the ordinary people living in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, East Anglia and the East Midlands, the world above their heads had changed.
It is called a cup, but in
The lord who took their tribute, the law court that settled their disputes, the language spoken in the marketplace, all of it had shifted overnight, and they had no choice but to adapt.
Good price for the cloth, lady.
And here is where the popular image really breaks down for me, because when you actually sit with the evidence, the charters, the chronicles, the archaeology, what you find in the Danelaw is not a wasteland. It is a marketplace, a busy, multilingual, mixed-up, functioning marketplace. History is almost never as simple as the stories we inherit about it. In the Danelaw, in the decades after the fighting settled, the daily life of most ordinary people was neither constant fear nor constant chaos. It was farming. The Scandinavians who had come as warriors were now the landlords of agricultural estates, and they needed the same things every landlord in England needed.
Good. Ensure the livestock count matches the ledger before winter.
Crops planted in the right season, animals well tended, rents paid on time.
And the honey, master.
recorded, you are clear until the harvest.
The Anglo-Saxon chronicle itself records that after Halfdan's army captured the north, they proceeded to plough and to support themselves. Norse farmers moved onto English land. They gave their farms Norse names: Grimsby, Derby, Whitby. The place name suffix by, from the Old Norse word for a farmstead or village, was scattered across the north and east of England like seeds in a strong wind. It is still there, sitting quietly in over 900 English place names, a fossilized record of exactly where the Scandinavians settled and stayed. The greatest evidence for what life in the Viking-ruled north actually looked like does not come from chronicles written by men who feared and resented these newcomers. It comes from the ground. In the late 1970s, archaeologists began excavating a single street in the centre of York, a street called Coppergate, whose name is itself a linguistic survival from the Old Norse Kopparigata, meaning the street of the cup makers. What they found beneath the basements of modern buildings was 9 meters of accumulated archaeological deposit, preserved in waterlogged peat that had kept organic material intact for 1,000 years. Timber, leather, cloth, bone, the framework of an entire world. The houses on Coppergate in the early 10th century were single-story structures about 7 meters long, their walls made of wattle, horizontal strips of wood woven through upright stakes, with a large central hearth defined by reused Roman tile. The floors were packed earth, the roofs were thatched, and in the corner of each house, archaeologists found the debris of whatever craft that household practiced. Wooden cores from a pole lathe spinning out cups and bowls, iron slag from a metalworker's forge, bone offcuts from a comb maker's bench, leather scraps from a shoemaker's last. There was no separation between home and workshop. You lived where you worked, and the evidence of both was trampled together into the floor. The combs deserve their own pause. Hundreds of them were recovered from Coppergate, made from antler, intricately carved, some still carrying faint traces of their original patterns. They were found in almost every single building on the street. Hygiene instruments, the archaeologists note, used for grooming and for removing head lice, but also objects of craft and pride. Their handles worked with geometric patterns that took real skill to produce. And this is the detail that always makes me laugh a little when I teach this. The Norse word for Saturday, laugardaga, literally means washing day. The people we were taught to picture as filthy barbarians had a dedicated hygiene day built into the week. Somewhere, I suspect, a medieval monk is rolling in his grave. What arrived into Jorvik, the Norse name for York, from the wider world, tells you more about this city's place in history than almost anything else. Baltic amber came in quantity for the workshops of jewelers. Rhineland pottery came upriver from the coast. Wine arrived in barrels from the Rhine Valley and Burgundy. And silk, Byzantine silk, brought all the way from the workshops of Constantinople via the long Varangian trade routes that snaked down the rivers of Russia to the Black Sea, arrived in quantities large enough for a local craftsman to make caps from it. A silk cap was actually found at Coppergate. A cowrie shell from the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf was found at Coppergate. Coins from Samarkand, so familiar in local trade that a forged copy was produced and passed without detection, were found at Coppergate. This was not a provincial backwater. This was a city tied to the entire medieval world. The coin dies unearthed here tell their own compressed story. One die, produced in Jorvik in the 920s, reads Skype Trio, abbreviated Latin for St. Peter, the patron saint of York Minster, the great cathedral the Vikings had inherited and continued to maintain. But on the same coin, die, alongside the Christian saint, someone had placed the hammer of Thor. It was not considered contradictory. Many of the Norse settlers in England converted to Christianity within decades of arriving, but they converted in the Norse way, by adding the new god to the existing framework, testing which powers worked, keeping whatever seemed effective. The hammer of Thor appeared on coins struck in the name of a Christian saint, and the people who used those coins apparently found this entirely reasonable. Religion in the Danelaw was a negotiation, not a replacement. And language changed the most quietly and the most permanently of all. The Norse settlers and the Anglo-Saxon population spoke related Germanic languages, different enough to cause confusion, but similar enough that communication was possible with effort. Over generations, they simplified. They dropped the complicated grammatical endings that both languages had used to signal meaning. Because when two groups with different grammar systems need to communicate urgently in a market, in a court, across a field boundary, they find the shared root and drop the decoration. The result was a streamlined, stripped-back version of English, more direct, more flexible, more capable of absorbing new vocabulary than the heavily inflected Old English it replaced. Modern English grammar, in significant part, is a product of what happened when Norse and Anglo-Saxon met in the Danelaw and had to understand each other quickly. Old Norse words entered the English spoken across the north and east, and they stayed, because they were needed, because they were useful, because the people who spoke them were now neighbours, spouses, trading partners, in-laws. The word law is Norse. The word window is Norse, vindauga, literally wind-eye. Egg is Norse, knife is Norse, husband is Norse, sky is Norse. The days of the week, Tuesday for Tew, Wednesday for Woden, Thursday for Thor, Friday for Frigg, are Norse. More than 3,000 words in modern English have Scandinavian roots, an inheritance so deep and so ordinary that we no longer hear it as foreign at all. And every time I think about this, I find it extraordinary. The Vikings did not only redraw the political map of England, they quietly reshaped the mouth of every English speaker who came after them. Every single time someone says the word sky or window or law, they are unconsciously speaking a fragment of Old Norse. We carry them inside us, and most of us never notice. The Danelaw ended politically in 954, when Eric Bloodaxe, the last Viking king of Northumbria, was driven out of Jorvik and fell on Stainmoor in the Pennines. The Anglo-Saxon kings had spent 3 generations reclaiming the Danelaw piece by piece. But the people themselves did not leave. The Norse settlers of Yorkshire, Lincolnshire and East Anglia did not pack their belongings and sail home to Scandinavia. They stayed, as they had always intended to stay. They married. Their children grew up speaking English with Norse words scattered through it, bearing Norse names, farming land with Norse place names, governed now by English kings who nonetheless kept many of the legal structures the Norse had established, because those structures worked. The identity that emerged from a century and a half of intermixing, Anglo-Scandinavian, as historians now call it, was something genuinely new, something that had not existed before the dragon prows appeared on the horizon off Lindisfarne. In York today, you can still stand on the street called Coppergate, the street of the cupmakers, and look at buildings whose foundations rest on the same ground where the Viking Age workshops once stood. The city still carries more than 1,000 Norse place name traces in its streets and its surrounding villages. Walk through it in autumn, when the low light comes in off the Yorkshire plain, and you are walking through a city that was shaped in its bones by people who came as sea wolves and stayed as neighbours. The monk at Lindisfarne, who heard those oars too late, could not have imagined what would grow from that morning. Not only ruin, but a new language, a richer law, and a city tied by silver and silk to the whole of the medieval world. If voyages like this one, into the dragon prows, the mixed-up marketplaces, the words still sitting on your tongue right now,
From the longships to the marketplace,
bringing you back to
the
this
echoes
channel.
of the past
Do me
still
a small
shape our
favour
tongue.
and hit subscribe.
We carry their word.
These stories always land best when we take them together. And here is my question for the comments tonight. If a single longship were to appear off your coast today, on a peaceful visit this time, not a raid, and you could show its crew one single object from your century that you think would truly astonish them, what would you pick? Tell me below. The best answers always spark the next story. I'm your host at Mystique History, and I will see you there.